Well, somebody needed to make this video. And I got to tell you, I've been a huge fan of the Timcast IRL and the Adam Crigler show, both. I watched the very first episode of Tim and Adam and have been a fan ever since, and then subscribed to Adam's podcast day one and been a fan of both. And I got to tell you something, Adam, you've lost a subscriber and your credibility's gone. And I think you're going to find out in the long run that a whole lot of your subscribers feel the way I feel. You could have said everything you needed to say without going into Tim's personal, private business and personal, private relationships, especially with family or a girlfriend, which neither of those is any of your business as an employee. None. And for you to, use all, I just feel like what you did was you conned us. Okay. You tell this story about how generous Tim was, and it was so confusing that he was so generous. So then you could not feel as bad about getting ready to slander him with private stuff that isn't anybody's business. And admittingly, you admit, Adam, that you never saw him do anything. So you're implying something that you're not even sure of. But that isn't why you lost me. That isn't what took your credibility away. You want to know what took your credibility away? Was when I listened to Tim's response and I find out you were on the payroll the entire time. He never fired you. He never let you go. And he even continued to pay you. The only thing he did was take you off the live stream. You were still an employee at Timcast and you were being paid very well. And you chose to leave that out of your whole little segue leading into the slander part, right? Why would you leave that out? Why would you leave that important detail out, Adam, if it wasn't to be deceptive? And I've often questioned why you can't seem to move on from the Timcast show. And what I mean by that is you're still using the exact same backdrop. You can't even come up with your own identity. And it just seems to me like you're still clinging on to that, and you got a bunch of spite. So that's where you lost your credibility, leaving out that very important detail that, you tell this whole story about how Tim was doing all these nice things for you, and it was just so confusing because, you weren't going to be working there anymore, and you just felt like your friendship wasn't that good, and why was he doing all these nice things, and it was such a mixed message, and, he helped you start your own podcast and gave you cameras and a microphone because you just had nothing, and come to find out, no, you were still an employee, and he was doing those things because you were an employee that worked there, and he does that for everybody that works there. Lets you stay in the mother-in-law suite because you had your wife with you. Well, he lets the other people that work there stay there too, right? You were still an employee, and you left that out. And I'm sorry, that puts your whole story at suspect for me. So I went back and listened to some of the stuff you said, now being suspicious, and dude, unreal. You say a lot of things that are contradictory and don't make sense. And what Tim has said and what Lydia has said does make sense. Now, I'm just telling you this as just a neutral observer. So I want to address some of these things, okay? Like I said, you could have told your reason for not being there anymore or what led up to you leaving the show. You could have said that without saying one word about Tim's personal business. And it seems to me you had a really difficult time separating work and personal relationships. And that's something you got to do in the big boy world. When you put your big boy pants on, you go and do a big boy job. You got to be able to separate work from personal relationships. And it just seems to me you're incapable of doing that. And like I say, you say all these nice things about him, and that's just a way to try to soften us up, so then you can slander him, and we'll say, well, the slander must be credibility because he said all these nice things about him. Or if you'd have just slandered him, it would have been suspect, right? Well, you're suspect, dude. Some of the stuff you say doesn't make sense. You at one point said that Lydia kept messing up, and she was messing up so bad that and Tim wouldn't do anything about it. And then 5 minutes later, into your rant, you tell us that Tim was yelling at her after every episode for screwing up. So you totally contradict yourself. And then you come across extremely big-headed because you say that Lydia had no experience. She was just a nurse before she started there. And Tim got her from his DMs on Instagram. Where did he get you? From a Magic the Gathering card game? You didn't have any experience either, Adam. None of you did. And I think that was part of what made the show gel, is nobody really, you guys sort of worked it out together. And that did resonate. It instead of being this polished like CNN episode or something, it was raw and real. Okay, that was part of the appeal. That was what led to the show's success, was the fact that none of you had any experience. And so for you to carry on like you were some celebrity already that should have been picking your own producer, and he brings in this person with no experience, when the truth is you didn't have any experience, and he got you from a card game. So, come on, dude. You need to humble up a little bit. You know, boy, doesn't money change people pretty quick. Doesn't it, though? And getting comfortable. So, for some of you that don't know, the story goes, okay, Adam, at one point in his life, had a girlfriend, and they made a decision to have an abortion, and he has felt tremendously guilty about that, which is understandable, okay? But Adam, you can't project that onto other people and expect them to walk on eggshells because you got an issue with it. And so Lydia said something that Adam felt was a punch at him, or a dig at him over the getting an abortion, because she was taking a pro-life stance. And as soon as the show was over, he blew up at her and was screaming and yelling at her to the point she was crying. And so here's Tim Pool. He's got two friends that live there that are going at each other. And he's got two employees that work there that are going at each other. And he's got to step in and do something. And what do? You give him an ultimatum? Her or me? I want to tell you something, man. As a supervisor, as somebody that was a supervisor at a very young age and a business owner, I would have fired you on the spot. And no, I wouldn't have helped you set up a podcast in my spare room and kept you on the payroll and let you do other projects. I would have walked you out and you'd have been fired, and that would have been the end of it. So Tim was incredibly gracious, because you can never, as an employee, cave to an ultimatum like that, because you've got to look at Tim. You can't expect Tim to feel about Lydia the way you felt about her, right? Obviously, Tim saw something in her the same way he saw something in you. And you can't expect him to have the same feelings for her that you do. If you don't like her, you can't demand that he don't like her. Right? And for what we understand, she put a lot of work in off the show. in research and gathering information and setting things up. And you didn't do much but just like lay in bed just like Ian till 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and then pop your head up and set on the show and look cute and say a couple contradictory things and make a ton of money. And you're just incredibly ungrateful. You know, he could have picked anybody. That lightning could have hit anybody. And I want you to ask yourself right now, Adam, you just right now, where would you be today had Tim Pool not invited you to be on a new podcast he was starting? Would you still just be a skater kid playing Magic the Gathering, not doing anything with your life? I can guarantee you wouldn't be living in Sweden in a new house with a fistful of cash. See, you are ungrateful. And that really changes the way I see you as a human being. The fact that Tim was that gracious and it had that big of an impact on your life, changed your trajectory massively, and you repay him by slandering him months later for no apparent reason other than just to slander the guy. And because, dude, you're not fooling anybody. You could have told your reason for not being there and not mentioned one thing about Tim's personal relationships. And I want to talk about this pay thing that you touched on. Okay, I've been a business owner, been a supervisor for years, and I also worked in a commission base. And I had early in my career, I started working at a dealership that was brand new. And I was making pretty doggone good money as a technician, but they wanted me to go into this assistant manager role. And they gave me an offer of 20% on upsells, okay, in the service department. And it was just starting out at the time. They only had 4 technicians, and we were averaging around 10 customers, maybe 15 customers a day, right? So that amount of commission would have allowed me to make a competitive wage and make the job worth having, right? And staying there. And that's why they gave me the 20% at that time, because it literally put my salary up to a place I would have been making had I went to work at an already established service department, if that makes sense. Okay. So let's say the earning expectation was 80 grand a year. They know that they got to, with just starting out, they're going to have to give me a pretty high commission to get me up to that rate so that the job's worth taking, the job's worth accepting. But once it took off and we went from 10 to 15 customers a day and having 4 technicians and being open till 5, to having 12 technicians, seeing 35 to 40 cars a day and being open till midnight, now all of a sudden I'm making 3 times what I ought to be making. I'm making 3 times as much of what I would be making working any other place doing that same job. So I knew the day was coming that we were going to revisit my percentage. I knew it. And because I was mature enough to understand the job wasn't worth what I was getting paid. I was being grossly overpaid. And every time that check came, I was terribly thankful because I knew the day was coming that it was going to get reset, and it did. And then it was adjusted back down to just slightly above what I would have been making working for any other established service department at that time. And that is exactly the same scenario you had when you and Tim started that deal, and Tim started it with all of you with no experience, just choosing regular people. You, a guy he met at a card game, and Lydia, a girl he met on Instagram, right? He set that rate high enough that you would get paid a decent competitive wage of what a co-host on a podcast should get. But once the show took off, dude, now you're making 3 times what any other co-host would make. It's time to revisit it. And I can't believe you're still whining about it, because you knew you were getting overpaid too. And you knew that percentage was set based on what you were earning expectation was at the time when you started it, not at the time when the thing had took off and went and gotten really popular. So I don't blame Tim's accountant or him, either one, whoever's idea was, the salary needed to reset. And if you were an adult, you would have understood that. So you lose some credibility there. And then, you continually keep making reference to Lydia not having any experience. Well, you didn't have any either, buddy. And I'll tell you what she did couldn't have been that bad, because the show did terribly well. So if you're telling me that the show did that great and she was just so horrible, it just doesn't jive, dude. And I watched all those episodes. They seemed produced okay to me. I mean, I saw a few blunders here and there, but that was to be expected. But you guys all, learned, fumbled through it together. And that's what made it work. And here you are dragging her for it, acting like, you're some highfalutin celebrity that ought to be picking his own producer, when you'd never set your butt behind a podcast camera a day in your life. So, and like I said, and Tim touched on the fact, and I believe him too. I believe him that Lydia was probably grinding a lot off camera, and you were in bed or jiving or just hanging out and crap, not putting the work in. I totally believe that did happen. And and I've always called into question why you can't seem to leave the show. Okay, you still haven't left the show, Adam. When are you going to become the Adam Crigler show instead of the guy that used to be on Timcast? Because you're still the guy that used to be on Timcast. And why do I say that? Well, your backdrop. When are you going to be original and be your own guy? I mean, you still mimic the exact same backdrop you had on the Tim show. And I'm sorry, Adam, it's time for you to move on from that. It's time for you to have your own identity and quit riding Tim's coattails, because you're still doing it. And here you are, sitting in Sweden with your own podcast and a fistful of cash, and you're a victim. You wouldn't be there. If Tim hadn't invited you to be on that show, you wouldn't be sitting where you're sitting right now. We all know that. I think even your wife knows that. So you lost some credibility there. And then you actually insult Tim's girlfriend without even knowing it. Because you paint this picture that Lydia was just constantly all over Tim. Just constantly all over him and flirting with him and coming on to him right in front of his girlfriend. And that really got to you. Well, how's come it didn't bother her? How's come there wasn't no blow up between her and Lydia? And, talking to my wife about that, and she agreed, Adam. We don't believe that. There is no way Lydia could have been as blatantly flirtatious as you claim, right in front of Tim's girlfriend, and Tim's girlfriend not have an issue with it. They would have come to a head, and there would have been some resolution, like either Lydia not living there anymore and just coming in and going home at the end of the day or something, right? There would have been some resolution. There's no way Tim's girlfriend would have just sat there and let it go on like some dumb bimbo that doesn't have a brain of her own and is just there to just, she'll tolerate whatever it takes to be there. Because that's the picture you're painting of her. You're painting her as this weak person that would just had to sit by and let some other woman mess with her man. And I just don't buy it, dude. I think you said some fluff there. And it couldn't have been as bad as you described. And folks, again, I'm going to remind you, all you people that are just tickled to death, you're getting to hear this personal crap. Adam admittingly says he never saw him do anything. He doesn't like Lydia, and he's assuming something went on. But he never saw anything. He never witnessed anything. He just assumed. So let's be a little bit cautious jumping on the bandwagon there and dragging Tim and Lydia over this accusation from Adam that's just an assumption of his, because he never saw him do anything. Right, Adam? You never saw him do anything. So if you never saw him do anything, what the hell are you doing implying that they did? What is that all about? So you blow up at a coworker to the point that they're in tears. You force your boss to take some kind of an action. Most bosses would have fired you on the spot and walked you out. And what you do is, instead, you give Tim an ultimatum. He keeps you on the payroll, lets you live there, helps you start your own podcast, promotes it, and even calls YouTube to get you monetized, lets you use all of his equipment, and you tell the story how, well, I just didn't have nothing, and he gave me a camera, and he gave me a microphone. Dude, you guys were pulling down $20,000 an episode and doing 5 to 6 episodes a week. And you couldn't buy a webcam and a microphone? So I don't believe that little story either. That just don't even make sense. Tim gave you that stuff to use because you still worked there. You were still an employee there. And so you tried to deceive us again. And then there's just so much. And dude, I'm sorry, your credibility with me is toast. Just toast. I find you incredibly ungrateful and incredibly spiteful, and I'm just not going to watch your show anymore until, maybe someday you'll quit being the guy that was on Timcast and you'll start being the Adam Crigler show. And when that happens, maybe I'll be interested in watching again. But man, this total mimic of the backdrop, even the props, all identical. Just crazy, man. I just can't believe he done him that way. He literally kept you on the payroll, let you live there. And then when you finally figured out that you weren't going to get your way, he wasn't going to just get rid of people because you demanded it, you decide you're going to move, and you decide you're going to move to Sweden of all places, and he pays for it. Almost $20,000. And this is how you repay him. He's never said a cross word about you. And neither is Lydia, by the way. So yeah, Adam, you I know you're high and you're giddy right now because people are just thrilled to death to get to see somebody try to tear Tim down. But when the dust settles, you're going to find out that this hurt you a lot more than it hurt him, because I'm not a fan anymore. I look at you as somebody that is spiteful and big-headed and ungrateful. You were nobody when Tim invited you to be on that show, Adam. You were nobody. You had no experience, and you have no right talking about anybody else's experience because you didn't have any either. And you literally get to a point in your rant where you're like acting like Tim should be listening to you about how to do a podcast, a political podcast, and then start comparing him to Joe Rogan when Joe Rogan doesn't even do a political podcast. Joe Rogan does interviews of people. Tim has guests on that talk about political stuff. Joe Rogan has people on that talk about themselves. It's a whole different program. And you stand there and talk like Tim ought to be taking advice from you. Well, Tim's the guy that's doing really well, and you're the little nobody with 200,000 subscribers that you got from him. So I think it's time for you to shrink the head a little bit, humble up a little bit, and do a little bit of inventory, Adam. Go right now, go look in the mirror and say, where would I be today had Tim not invited me to be on his new podcast? And then I think you're going to realize that what you just did was terrible. And it sounds to me like the bridges were not burnt. You didn't get your way, but Tim still considered you a friend, was still willing to pay for you to move, was still willing to open a coffee shop and sell your coffee in it. So the bridge wasn't burnt. It's just you didn't get your way and you were full of spite. He chose Lydia over you and you were jealous. And you spent a huge portion of this rant just talking about how much you hated her. So, yeah, your credibility's gone, dude. And for now, I can't take you serious anymore. So, yeah, until something changes or maybe there's an apology or something, I'm pretty much done with you. And I bet I'm not alone. I bet you got a lot of other fans that feel the same way.